The first time Maude Walker heard the word coward attached to Luke Calloway's name, she was standing at the dry goods counter with a bolt of blue calico in her hands, and something in her chest went very still, the way a prairie goes still before a storm that changes the shape of the land. It was the spring of 1882 in Cutter's Creek, Texas, a town of perhaps 300 souls pressed between a slow brown river and a ridge of limestone hills that turned pink at sunset. The town had a livery, a church, a saloon that never quite closed, a general store run by a man named Horace Biddle who was equally skilled at measuring fabric and spreading gossip, and a reputation for being harder on quiet men than on loud ones. That was the particular cruelty of the place. Loudness was mistaken for courage, and silence was mistaken for shame. Luke Calloway had arrived in Cutter's Creek 8 months before the spring in question, riding in on a gray roan horse with a bedroll tied to the back of his saddle, and nothing more than a canvas satchel hanging from one shoulder. He had taken the job nobody wanted, the one posted on the notice board outside the sheriff's office in faded ink: fence-mender, water diverter, general hand for the parcels of ranch land that had gone to seed after old Chester Munro died and his 3 sons spent his money on cards and women and whiskey and left the land to crumble. The sons were gone now. The land remained. A man named Elias Pratt had purchased it at auction for less than it was worth and had immediately advertised for someone to restore it, because Elias Pratt understood land but had no patience for the patient work of healing it. Luke was 28 years old. He had gray eyes that caught light in an unusual way, the color of creek water in November, and a mouth that seemed made more for thinking than for speaking. He was not particularly tall nor particularly short, not the kind of man you would pull from a crowd by appearance alone, but when he worked, and Maude would learn this slowly, the way you learn anything worth knowing, there was a quality to his movement that was unlike anything she had ever seen. He did not waste a motion. Every swing of the hammer, every post set into the ground, every length of wire stretched between cedar posts happened with a precision and a calm that was almost beautiful, the way mathematics is beautiful when it is perfectly expressed. But no one in Cutter's Creek was watching closely enough to see that. They saw a man who did not drink at the saloon, did not raise his voice at poker tables, did not strut the boardwalk on Saturday evenings with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops. They saw a man who arrived before dawn and left after dark and said very little in between, and because they did not understand what they were seeing, they called it weakness. Maude Walker was 24 years old and had been a widow for 2 years. Her husband, Thomas Walker, had been gored by a longhorn steer on a Tuesday morning in May of 1880, and the grief of it had not broken her but had made her more careful, the way a bone healed right becomes harder than it was before the break. She was not a beautiful woman in the conventional sense that Cutter's Creek measured beauty. She did not have Clara Pratt's golden hair or Dolar's Ray's perfect complexion, but she had strong cheekbones and dark eyes that had a way of landing on a thing and staying there, and when she turned those eyes on a person, that person tended to feel as though they had been genuinely seen, which was an uncomfortable sensation for most people and a welcome one for very few. She ran a small boarding house on the east side of town, 6 rooms that she kept clean and warm, and she cooked meals for her boarders every morning and evening. The work was relentless, but it was hers, and she had learned to love the relentlessness of it because it left her no room to be afraid. She had heard Luke Calloway's name before she ever saw his face. Horace Biddle mentioned him, the way Horace mentioned everything, with a studied casualness that meant he wanted a response. "That hand Pratt hired," Horace said, wrapping her calico with brown paper and twine, "fellow named Calloway. You heard about him. Been here all these months and not a word spoken against the Deacon brothers, not a word at all. They rode past his work site last Tuesday. You know what he did? Nothing. Kept his head down, kept working, like he didn't even see them." The Deacon brothers were a different matter entirely. There were 3 of them, Clement, Harlan, and young Silas, who was 19 and trying hard to be as mean as his older brothers. And they had been a presence in Cutter's Creek and the surrounding county since their father, old Reuben Deacon, had run cattle through the territory back in the days when there were fewer fences and fewer questions. They were not outright outlaws in the way the law could prove, but they were the kind of men who understood that the line between legal and illegal was just a line drawn in sand, and sand could be moved. They ran a protection arrangement with several small ranchers, the kind of arrangement where the word protection meant exactly the opposite of what it appeared to mean. They had a talent for making things difficult for people who did not cooperate with them, and they had been watching the Munro Pratt land for some time because it bordered their own grazing territory, and they resented not having acquired it at auction. "He was probably afraid," said a woman whose name was Pearl Hutchins, standing near the thread display with her basket on her arm, and there it was, the word, dropped into the air with the casual certainty of someone who has never had to examine their assumptions. Afraid. Coward. The two words were already bonded together in the town's vocabulary before the month was out. Maude paid for her calico. She thought about the word afraid. She thought about how many things in this world were called afraid that were actually something else strategic or considered or simply beyond the understanding of the person applying the label. She said nothing, because she did not yet know anything. She was not the kind of woman who spoke before she knew. The first time she saw Luke Calloway, it was at the feed store, and he was doing something that would have seemed insignificant to anyone but Maude. He was helping a very old Mexican man named Guillermo Vasquez load sacks of grain onto a cart, and he was doing it without ceremony, without the performance of charity that many men employed when they did something kind in a public place. He did not look around to see if anyone was watching. He did not say anything to Guillermo beyond what was necessary. He simply lifted and carried, and when the last sack was loaded, he touched the brim of his hat to Guillermo, who said something low in Spanish that Luke apparently understood because he smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and has nothing to prove. Maude stood with her list of supplies and watched this and felt something she did not immediately recognize because she had not felt it in 2 years, since before Thomas died and left the world smaller than it had been. She told herself it was nothing. She was good at telling herself things. She saw him again the following week, this time at the edge of the Pratt property where the road ran close to the fence line, and she was driving her small wagon back from the Hendersons' farm where she had collected eggs and 2 laying hens, and she pulled up because one of her wheels had caught on a rut, and she did not want to stress the axle without looking at it first. She was examining the wheel, which meant she was crouched beside the wagon in the road, when a voice said, "May I look at that for you?" She looked up. He was standing at the fence line with a post-hole digger in his hand, and he had apparently walked over from wherever he had been working, not hurriedly, but directly, without the elaborate hesitation of a man who is not sure of his welcome. "I can manage it," she said, because she could, and because she said that to everyone. "I expect you can," he said, and he did not argue further, which surprised her. Most men who offered help and were refused either withdrew in offense or pressed harder. Luke Calloway simply waited, watching the wheel with the same quality of attention she had noticed when he helped Guillermo at the feed store, and after a moment she realized that the waiting was its own form of helpfulness. He was not going anywhere. He was simply present. "The rim has caught on a nail head," she said. "There, you see it. The wood has split just slightly." He crouched beside her and looked. He smelled of cedar sawdust and hard work and nothing else. "You have anything in the wagon?" "A pry bar, any kind of bar." She did, in fact. She handed it to him. He worked the nail out of the wood with the kind of careful efficiency she was already coming to associate with him, and the wheel came free of the rut without damage, and the whole thing took perhaps 4 minutes. "Thank you," she said. "Luke Calloway," he said, which was his way of introducing himself. "I know who you are," she said. "Maude Walker." "I know who you are too," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than was socially expected, because she was trying to read what he knew, and whether he had heard the word widow attached to her name, and whether that word changed anything in his eyes. It did not appear to. He looked at her the way he had looked at Guillermo's grain sacks, directly, practically, with a kind of basic respect that had nothing performative about it. "Your fence line is looking good," she said, because it was. Something moved in his face. Not quite surprise, but close to it, the expression of a man who is not used to being noticed for his work. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that was heavier than the words suggested. She drove on. She thought about him for the rest of the day and told herself she was not thinking about him. By May of that year, the whispers about Luke Calloway's alleged cowardice had hardened from whispers into something more like settled opinion. The Deacon brothers had helped that along considerably. Clement Deacon, who was the eldest and most cunning of the three, had taken to mentioning Luke at the saloon with a particular kind of contemptuous amusement, the kind that is designed to accumulate an audience. He had ridden past Luke on the road twice and called out things that were meant to provoke, and Luke had not responded in the way Clement wanted, the way that would give Clement an excuse for something more physical, something that would establish a hierarchy. Luke simply looked at Clement the way a man looks at weather, acknowledging it, assessing it, giving it neither more nor less weight than it deserved. The town read this as cowardice. Clement Deacon was a big man with a bad temper, and most men looked away from him fast or looked at him with visible fear. A man who did neither was either brave or something broken, and since the town had already decided on an interpretation, they stuck with it. Maude had not decided yet. She was still watching. She ran into Luke at the church social in the second week of May. He was there because Elias Pratt had brought him. Elias being a sociable man who believed that a man worked better if he was known in a community, and Luke stood at the edge of the gathering with a plate of food that he was eating with the quiet appreciation of a man who does not always eat this well. Maude was there because she had brought 3 pies, and because her boarders liked to know she was part of the community, which was good for business. She crossed the yard to him because she wanted to, and she did not spend time manufacturing reasons. "The food is better than it looks," she said, nodding at his plate. He looked up from the plate. Something in his expression loosened slightly when he saw her. "It is," he agreed, "the pie especially." "I made that pie," she said. "Then I am doubly in your debt," he said. "First the wheel, now the pie." "I did not make the pie for you." "No," he agreed, "but I can still be grateful it exists." They stood together and talked for perhaps an hour, and it was the kind of talking that happens between people who discover to their mutual surprise that they have been thinking about the same things from different angles. Luke was from a small town in West Kansas, had spent years working other people's land and learning from it, had come to Texas because the land here was different, rougher. It asked more of you and gave you more back if you understood how to ask. He spoke about soil and water, and the way land communicates its needs the way some people speak about music, with the vocabulary of a person who has spent time becoming fluent in something. Maude listened with the full quality of her attention, and he noticed her listening, and she noticed him noticing, and neither of them said anything about that. She asked him about the Deacon brothers, not to test him but because she was curious. He was quiet for a moment. "I know who they are," he said. "I know what they want from that land and from Elias. I am not interested in giving them a reason to escalate before the time is right." "Before the time is right," she repeated. "Provoking men like that before you are ready for the consequences is not courage," he said. "It is vanity." She thought about this for a long time afterward. The time became right faster than anyone expected, and its arrival was not through any choice of Luke's. In the third week of May, Elias Pratt's foreman, a decent man named Harv Sully, came to Elias with information that Clement Deacon had been running his cattle across the Pratt fence line at night, deliberately tearing the wire in sections that Luke had just repaired, and the damage was calculated. It looked like natural decay, but it was not. It was systematic, and it was aimed at making Luke's work appear incompetent, at giving Elias grounds to question whether the land was worth the labor and the investment. Elias was not a weak man, but he was a practical one, and Clement Deacon was good at making practical men doubt. Luke came to Elias with the evidence before Harv did. He had found the boot prints near the wire distinctive, a crescent-shaped nick in the left heel of a man's boot, and he had found cattle droppings that were fresh in areas where no cattle should have been, and he had pieced it together with the patience of a man who does not draw conclusions until he has enough evidence to be certain, and then he was completely certain. He laid it out for Elias on the kitchen table with the kind of systematic clarity that surprised Elias, who had hired Luke for his hands rather than his mind and was discovering that he had gotten both. "What do you want to do?" Elias asked. "Document it," Luke said. "Every section, every time. Keep records with dates. And I need to work the southern fence at night for a while. Alone, for now." Elias looked at him for a long time. "You are not afraid of them," Elias said, not as an accusation but as a discovery. "I have been afraid of things in my life," Luke said. "Clement Deacon is not one of them." Maude heard about this from Elias himself, who stopped by her boarding house 2 days later to settle his account for the room his visiting nephew had occupied. And Elias was the kind of man who talked when he was unsettled by something, and he was clearly unsettled by what he had seen in Luke Calloway at his kitchen table. He told her about the evidence, about Luke's plan, about the way Luke had spoken about the Deacon brothers without any of the bravado that other men used to cover fear, and without any of the fear itself. Maude poured Elias his coffee and listened and did not say anything, but something was happening inside her that she was beginning to have difficulty naming as nothing. She started going to the fence line. She told herself it was because she needed to check on the condition of the trail that ran past the Pratt property, which her wagon used twice a week for deliveries. She told herself it was practical, that she needed to know if the trail was being damaged. She was not very convincing to herself. She watched him work on the southern fence line on a clear Tuesday morning when the light came in low and gold from the east, and the limestone hills were bright behind him. He had a system. He would assess the whole section before touching any of it, walking it with his eyes on the ground and the wire both, reading what had happened and what needed to happen. Then he worked from south to north, systematic, and each post was set with absolute precision, the kind of precision that looks easy until you understand what it requires. She sat on the fence rail of the adjacent property, which belonged to an old farmer named Cal Prout who did not mind, and she watched. She was not hiding. She was simply watching, and she was beginning to understand what she was seeing. At mid-morning he straightened from his work and looked up and saw her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You have been here for 2 hours. "I have," she agreed. "Cal Prout's fence rail is not the most comfortable seat." "No," she agreed again. He walked to the fence that separated them, wiping his hands on his work trousers. He was close enough now that she could see the details of his face clearly. The way concentration had put a small vertical line between his brows that had not quite smoothed away, the dust in his hair, the calluses on his hands that told a whole autobiography of hard work. "Why are you watching?" he asked. She considered giving him a practical answer. She had several prepared. She gave him the true one instead. "Because the town says one thing and I am watching and I see another thing entirely." Something passed through his eyes that she did not have a word for, but that moved her, the way certain pieces of music move you without your permission. "What do you see?" he asked quietly. "I see a man who knows exactly what he is doing," she said. "I see a man who has more plans than conversations." He looked at her for a long moment. The grasshoppers were very loud in the June grass around them, and a hawk was working the thermals high above, and somewhere behind her a meadowlark was insisting on itself, and none of these sounds seemed at all intrusive. They seemed exactly right. "Maude Walker," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she had not heard in 2 years, a quality she had convinced herself she did not miss. "Luke Calloway," she said back, and that made him smile, the real smile, the one from the feed store. In the weeks that followed, she came back to watch him work whenever her schedule allowed, and he began to find small ways to make the watching easier. He would start on the section closest to Cal Prute's fence rail when he knew she would come, so she did not have to walk far to see. He did not mention this calculation. She noticed it anyway, the way she noticed everything about him. They talked during his midday meal, which he ate sitting in the shade of a live oak tree, and the conversations grew longer and deeper and more personal in the way of conversations between people who are discovering that trust is possible. He told her about his father, a homesteader in Kansas who had died of influenza when Luke was 14, and how he had gone to work for neighboring farms to help his mother and younger sister, and how the work had become not just survival but education, how he had learned things from the land that no school could have taught him. She told him about Thomas, about the marriage that had been good in the practical ways and warm in most of the personal ones, and about the strange guilt of grieving someone who had not been your great love but had been genuinely good to you. She had never said that to anyone. She did not know it was true until she said it to him, and the truth of it once spoken was both a sadness and a relief. He listened the way he worked without waste, without performance, with complete presence. By July she knew she was falling in love with him, and she did not tell herself otherwise anymore. The trouble with the Deacon brothers came to a head in the first week of August, not at the fence line but in the center of town, and it happened in front of an audience, which was exactly what Clement had been waiting for. Luke had gone to the hardware store to collect supplies, wire, staples, some specific hardware that Elias had ordered, and Clement Deacon was there with Harlan, both of them loud with an afternoon's worth of whiskey, and Clement blocked the doorway when Luke came out with his supplies. It was deliberate, calculated, performed for the benefit of 3 men standing on the boardwalk across the street and the 2 women who had stopped to watch from the millinery doorway. "There is the brave fence-mender," Clement said, spreading his arms wide to indicate the doorway he was filling. "Working hard for old Pratt, keeping his head down, real quiet like. We have been riding past for weeks and he never says a word. You deaf, Calloway, or just yellow?" The street had gone very quiet. People do not need to be told when something is about to happen. The air changes, thickens, and everyone feels it. Luke stood with his supplies. He was completely still. His gray eyes moved from Clement to Harlan and back to Clement, and he said nothing. "Nothing to say," Clement pressed, stepping forward. "A coward and a mute. Pratt got himself a real prize." A few people on the boardwalk laughed. Not many, and not without discomfort, but they laughed. Maude was coming out of the dry goods store across the street with a basket on her arm, and she stopped on the boardwalk and watched. She did not move forward. She did not call out. She watched because watching was what she had been doing, and she knew something that the rest of the street did not know yet. "I have things to say," Luke said finally, his voice carrying in the quiet street without being raised. "I choose carefully where I say them." "That's so?" Clement stepped closer. "That is so," Luke said. "For instance, I am not going to say them on a public street in front of people who have been drinking since midday. I have better manners than that." There was a beat of silence. Then another. Clement's face went through several expressions. He had been expecting anger or fear or the kind of clumsy verbal escalation that would give him what he wanted. He had not been expecting this calm, contained, and somehow more dignified than anything Clement could match in his current state. "You are a coward," Clement said, but it was flatter now, less certain. "You are welcome to think so," Luke said, and stepped around him and walked down the street with his supplies. The audience watched him go. On the boardwalk across the street, Maude watched too. She did not applaud. She did not call his name. She stood very still with her basket on her arm and felt something in her chest that was so large she was not sure the word love was sufficient for it. That evening he came to her boarding house. This was not unusual. He had been coming to supper twice a week for the past month, which was a fact that all 6 of her boarders had noted, and some of them had commented on with varying degrees of tact. He came to the back door this time, which he had not done before, and knocked rather than simply presenting himself at the supper table. And when she opened the door, he looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. "I thought you might want to know," he said, "that I have not been ignoring the situation with the Deacon brothers." "I know you have not," she said. "I want you to know the whole of it," he said. "I have documentation, dates, descriptions, witnesses. Harv Sully has kept records too, independently. There is enough here for the sheriff to act, and I have a meeting with Sheriff Bowman on Thursday morning." She looked at him. The lamplight was warm, and the June bugs were working in the elm tree by the back fence, and from inside her house came the sound of her boarders talking over supper. "Luke," she said. "Maude," he said. "Come in and eat," she said, "and tell me everything." He sat at her kitchen table after the boarders had finished, and she poured him coffee and listened to the whole of it. The documentation, the plan, the careful months of preparation that looked from the outside like nothing at all, like a man keeping his head down, like a man without a spine. And as he talked, she understood more completely than she ever had what she had been watching all those months at the fence line. She had been watching a man work, and the work was so patient and so thorough and so free of vanity that a town full of people who had never developed the patience to look carefully had mistaken it for emptiness. They had called him a coward because they did not know how to read what they were seeing. Because real courage, she understood now, the courage that changes things rather than just proving something about the man employing it, looked like this. Quiet, methodical, sure. She put her hand over his on the kitchen table. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and his gray eyes had that quality of holding light, the way clear water holds light, and he turned his hand so that his palm was against her palm and their fingers were interlaced, and neither of them moved for a long moment. "I am not quiet because I am afraid," he said. "I need you to know that." "I know," she said. "I have known for a long time. I have wanted to tell you something for some weeks," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said. "Not because of your courage, though you have more of it than anyone I know. Not because of your kindness, though you have that too. Because of the way you look at things. You look at things until you actually see them, and most people never manage that." Her chest was full of something she did not have words for. She did not try to find words. She leaned forward slightly, and he leaned forward to meet her, and they were very close together in the lamplight and the June bugs and the distant conversation from the front room. "You are going to have to let me know," she said softly, "what you intend to do about this." "About the Deacon brothers?" he asked. "About me," she said. He was quiet for just a moment, and then he said, "I intend to court you properly, Maude Walker, if you will allow it. I intend to make myself useful in every way I can and to be worthy of the way you have been watching me all these months, because I have not missed a moment of it, and I want to earn what it means." She squeezed his hand. "You have already earned it," she said, "but I will allow the courtship anyway." He smiled. The real smile. And she thought that if she could see that smile every day for the rest of her life, the rest of her life would be enough. Sheriff Hal Bowman was a man in his late 50s who had seen enough of the territory to be skeptical of almost everything, and yet had somehow managed to remain honest, which was rarer than it should have been. When Luke sat down across from him on Thursday morning with the documentation spread on the desk between them, Bowman put on his reading glasses and went through everything without speaking for 20 minutes, which was the kind of attention that meant he was taking it seriously. "This is thorough," Bowman said at last. "I wanted to make it difficult to dismiss," Luke said. Bowman looked at him over the glasses. "The Deacons have friends in this county." "I know they do," Luke said. "That is why I also sent copies to the county land office in Austin and to a lawyer in San Antonio that Elias Pratt has retained. The paper trail exists in 3 places now." Bowman set down the documents. He looked at Luke for a long moment with an expression that combined professional assessment with something that might have been respect. "Son," he said, "you have been letting those brothers make noise about you all over this county for 8 months." "Yes, sir," Luke said. "And this whole time you were building this." "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you tell someone what you were doing?" Luke was quiet for a moment. Because I needed it to be done before it was known, he said. And because I do not require an audience for my work. Bowman took off his glasses and polished them on his shirt. I am going to ride out to the Deacon property this afternoon, he said. I am going to present these findings, and I am going to make clear that the county land office and a lawyer in San Antonio are aware of what has been happening and are watching the situation. The Deacons are not stupid enough to escalate when there is a paper trail that goes to Austin. No, Luke agreed. They are not. This does not mean they will not find other ways to make trouble. I know that too, Luke said, but it changes what they can do and how they can do it. And it protects Elia's land going forward. Bowman stood and extended his hand. Luke stood and shook it. I am sorry, Bowman said, that this town has been running its mouth in ways it ought to have been ashamed of. Luke shook his head once. It does not matter, he said. It matters to some of us, Bowman said. When word spread, and it spread quickly, because this was Cutter's Creek and nothing was private for long, the town's reaction was the particular kind of communal embarrassment that arrives when people realize they have been confidently wrong about something significant. Horace Biddle at the dry goods store found himself suddenly very busy restocking shelves whenever the topic of Luke Calloway came up. Pearl Hutchins, who had said the word afraid over the calico, developed a persistent need to be on the other end of whatever room Maude was in. The men who had laughed at Clement Deacon's jokes outside the hardware store became very interested in the weather. The Deacons went quiet, which was its own form of confirmation. Clement did not come to town for 2 weeks after Bowman's visit, and when he did not stop outside the hardware store. He collected his supplies and left without making eye contact with anyone, and somehow, in the absence of his loudness, his actual size seemed to diminish. Luke continued to work. The fence line was finished by the end of August, and the water diversion project, which Luke had designed to bring better irrigation to the eastern sections of the Pratt land, something no one had managed in the 15 years since old Chester Munro owned it, was underway by September. People who had business on the road past the Pratt property began to stop and watch the way Maude had been watching for months, and now that they knew the context of it, they could see what was there. Skill of a rare and dedicated kind, the kind that does not announce itself. It was Elias Pratt who said it in the open, at the church social in September, standing on the porch with a glass of cider and enough people around him to make it count. I have worked with a great many men in my life, and I will tell you this without qualification. Luke Calloway is the finest worker and the smartest strategist I have ever had on this land. Anyone who called him a coward was not watching. They were performing. No one disagreed. The ones who had been the loudest about the cowardice were conspicuously quiet, which was the closest they were going to come to an apology, and Luke, who was standing a few feet away, looked at the ground briefly and then back up at the horizon with an expression that said he had not needed the vindication, but was not entirely unmoved by it either. Maude stood 6 feet away from him and caught his eye and raised her glass slightly, and he acknowledged it with a small nod and the real smile, and she decided then and there that she was done waiting for things to develop at their own pace. She cornered him after the social, which was not a difficult thing to accomplish because he tended to linger at the edge of events until they concluded, unwilling to leave before it seemed right. She told her boarders to go on ahead, and she waited until the lamplight was just the porch lantern, and the sky was enormous with stars, the particular vastness of a Texas sky in September that makes everything below it feel both very small and very important. "Walk with me," she said. He walked with her down the lane that ran behind the church toward the river, the slow brown river that smelled of mineral and grass and thyme, and they walked close enough that their arms were almost touching, the not quite touching that is its own form of intimacy. "The work on the irrigation is going well," she said, because she had been watching that too. "It is," he said. "Another 2 weeks and the eastern section will have water all year. Elias must be pleased." "He is," Luke said. And then, because this was him and he did not circle things for very long when he had decided on a direction, "You said I could court you. I want to do it properly." "You have been doing it," she said. "I want to do it with intention," he said. "I want the town to know what my intentions are." She stopped walking and turned to look at him. The river was audible and the stars were thick, and his face in the silver light was the face of a man who had made up his mind, which was perhaps the most attractive thing about him, that certainty. "Luke Calloway," she said, "are you asking me if you may pursue me with the aim of marriage?" He did not flinch from the directness of it. "I am," he said. She was quiet for just a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to give the moment the gravity it deserved. "Yes," she said, "you may." He reached out and very carefully, very deliberately, took her hand. And they stood by the slow brown river in the September dark with the stars very thick above them. And for a while they did not say anything at all because there was nothing that needed saying. The courtship was a quiet and definitive thing, in keeping with both of their natures. He came to supper 3 times a week at her boarding house, and helped with whatever needed helping: a shutter that had come loose, a wagon wheel that needed re-greasing, the heavy lifting that a boarding house constantly generated. He brought her things he had found or made: once a piece of limestone from the ridge that was shot through with crystal, and caught the light in a way he knew she would appreciate. Once a jar of wild honey from a stand of brush at the edge of the Pratt property. Once a sprig of late-blooming bluebonnets that he delivered without ceremony and left on her kitchen windowsill. She cooked for him, not just with competence, but with the particular attention of a woman who is discovering that feeding someone can be an expression of something larger than hospitality. On Sundays after church they walked, sometimes by the river, sometimes out to the edge of the Pratt property where the work was ongoing, and he showed her what he was doing and why. And she asked questions that were intelligent enough that he answered them with genuine detail. And she learned about water and land, and the way the two negotiated with each other. And he learned about the boarding house and the small daily commerce of keeping people fed and housed and comfortable. And they found that their 2 kinds of knowledge spoke to each other in unexpected ways. The town watched them with the chastened fondness of a community that has been wrong about someone and is trying to make amends through goodwill. People who had never spoken to Luke found reasons to speak to him. The hardware store owner, a serious man named Gus Hennessy, shook Luke's hand one morning and said simply, "I should have looked more carefully." And Luke accepted this with neither false modesty nor visible bitterness, which was a grace that impressed people almost as much as the irrigation work. In October, on a dry, golden afternoon when the cottonwoods along the river had gone to brass, and the air had the particular sweet sharpness of early Texas autumn, Luke asked Maude to marry him. He did it on the porch of her boarding house, in the late afternoon, with 3 of her boarders inside clearly trying not to be obvious about the fact that they were listening. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a small gold band with a tiny pearl set in it, which he had carried in his coat pocket for 6 weeks, because he had bought it on a trip to the county seat in September, and had not yet found a moment that felt entirely right, and then had understood that there was never going to be a perfect moment, and that the imperfect moments were the only ones available, and that was not a problem. He stood on the porch steps, which put him slightly below her where she stood on the porch itself, and this meant he was looking up at her rather than down, which was not customary but felt right. He said he loved her, which came out steady and true without any of the faltering that usually surrounded those words. He said he believed they were people who could build a life together, not just share one, but genuinely construct it the way you construct something good, with care, with attention, with patience. He said he was not a man of great wealth and he could not promise her ease, but he could promise her honesty and hard work and a partner who would look at her, who would actually look at her, for every year they had. She stood on the porch above him and let herself cry, not from sorrow but from the fullness of the moment, the way some moments are too full to contain without spilling. "Yes," she said, and her voice was very clear. "Luke, yes." He came up the porch steps and put the ring on her finger, and she put both of her hands on his face, and he held her waist, and they stood like that for a long moment while inside the boarding house. Her boarders absolutely failed to be subtle about their reaction. And she laughed against his shoulder with her arms around his neck, and he laughed too. And it was one of those moments that a person carries inside them for the rest of their life, polished by time and memory into something almost too beautiful to be real, and yet entirely real. They married in December of 1882, on a cold, bright Saturday with the sky the color of bleached bone above the limestone hills. The church was full, which surprised both of them. They had expected a modest gathering and discovered that the town had decided to make it a statement of communal enthusiasm, perhaps as a kind of collective apology, or perhaps simply because the story of the two of them had become the kind of story that a place like Cutter's Creek needed, a story that reminded people what real things looked like beneath the performance of them. Reverend Oates performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, and Maude came down the aisle in a dress she had made herself from the blue calico she had been holding the day she first heard Luke called a coward, a fact she had told no one but which she knew, and which felt like a private joke between her and the universe. Luke stood at the front of the church in his best shirt, which was clean and pressed and perfectly adequate, and watched her walk toward him with an expression that every person in that church would remember later when they tried to describe the ceremony, an expression of complete and unconditional arrival, the look of a man who has reached the place he was heading before he knew he was heading there. They said their vows in clear, steady voices. Elias Pratt was there in the front row, beaming like a man who had done something very right by posting that notice for a fence-mender. Guillermo Vasquez was there, his dark face crinkled with pleasure. Sheriff Bowman was there, his hat in his hands. Harv Sully was there. Even Horace Biddle was there, looking honestly moved, which was perhaps his most genuine public moment in years. The Deacon brothers were not there. They had, over the course of the autumn, reduced their presence in Cutter's Creek considerably, which was a fact that everyone acknowledged and no one lamented. Clement had taken his cattle operation to a neighboring county, and Harlan had followed. Young Silas, 19 and not yet fully committed to his brother's path, had stayed, and in the following spring would get work on a neighbor's farm and become, by slow and improbable degrees, a decent enough member of the community. But that was later. On this December day, in the cold, bright church with the pine smell of the Christmas greenery, someone had put up early. Luke Calloway married Maude Walker, and the town witnessed it and was glad. The first year of their marriage was one of those years that a person looks back on as fundamentally formative, the year that established the shape of everything that followed. They moved into the boarding house together, Luke taking on the heavy work and the maintenance that had always been a strain when Maude managed it alone, and Maude continuing to run the house with the competence and warmth that had made it successful. It was not a glamorous life, boarding houses never were, but it was a full one, and fullness suited them both. Luke continued his work with Elias Pratt through the winter, finishing the irrigation system in February 1883, which was an extraordinary achievement considering the difficulty of the terrain. When the first rains came in March and water ran through the channels he had designed to the eastern section of land that had been dry for 15 years, Elias stood beside Luke in the field and watched it happen and shook his head slowly. "I am going to tell everyone I know about this," Elias said. "I want people to understand what a good man with real skill can do." Luke said nothing, but he was smiling, and Maude, who had driven out to watch, was smiling too. And when she caught his eye across the field, the look they exchanged said everything that needed saying between them. By spring they had discovered she was pregnant, which arrived as a joy so large and somewhat alarming that they sat with it quietly for several days before telling anyone. When they told Elias, he shook both their hands with excessive vigor. When they told Sheriff Bowman, he turned slightly pink and said, "Well now, that is fine news, just fine." When they told Guillermo Vasquez, He blessed them in Spanish, and then in English, and then produced from somewhere a small carved wooden figure, a guardian figure of a kind that had been in his family, and pressed it into Maude's hands with the solemnity of someone passing a real treasure. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer of 1883 was very hot, the kind of hot that settles into the bones and makes every task twice as effortful. But Maude was Maude, which meant she worked until she could not, and Luke was Luke, which meant he watched her carefully without interfering with her autonomy, and the balance they found between his protectiveness and her independence was one that both of them were proud of. In October of 1883, in the small upstairs room of the boarding house with the windows open to the cool autumn air, and a good-hearted woman named Edna Marsh attending as midwife, Maude gave birth to a boy. He came into the world with a full head of dark hair and his mother's decisive quality, a certain unmistakable quality of being completely present, and Luke sat beside the bed with his big hands careful around the tiny weight of his son, and looked at him with an expression that was something beyond what Maude had seen on his face before, something that was the face of a person encountering the most significant thing that has ever happened to them. "What do we call him?" Maude asked, exhausted and bright-eyed and more herself than she had ever looked. "Whatever you want," Luke said, not taking his eyes from the baby. "Thomas," she said, and there was a gentleness in her voice that was for the first Thomas, the man who had been good to her even if he had not been her great love, and a thankfulness in it for the fact that life had given her this second chapter. "Thomas Luke Calloway." Luke looked up at her. His gray eyes were wet and he did not try to hide it. "Thomas Luke," he said, and he leaned forward and kissed her forehead and kept his lips there for a moment. "Yes." Little Thomas Luke Calloway was a healthy, loud, curious child, who from the very beginning had his father's quality of complete attention to whatever he was looking at, and his mother's complete directness of opinion, which was a combination that made him exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. He was welcomed by the boarding house boarders with various degrees of enthusiasm, the most genuine being from an old school teacher named Mr. Hayward, who occupied the corner room, and who began reading aloud to the baby at approximately 3 weeks old, proceeding through the complete works of Washington Irving before Thomas was 6 months. The work of the boarding house continued, expanded, found its rhythm with 2 adults managing it. Luke took on a second project the following spring, this time from a different rancher north of town who had heard about the irrigation work and wanted something similar. His reputation, which had been systematically undermined by the deacons and then systematically rebuilt by truth, was now something that traveled ahead of him, the reputation of a man who did what he said and knew more than he appeared to know and solved problems that other men had declared unsolvable. He was hired on those terms and delivered on them, and the satisfaction of this, not the recognition itself, but the alignment between the work and its acknowledgement, was something he allowed himself to feel without embarrassment. Maude told him he deserved it and meant it absolutely, and he believed her, which was the particular grace of being known by someone who has been watching you work. In the spring of 1884, something happened that was unexpected but not unwelcome. Elias Pratt came to them with a proposal. He was getting older, his joints protesting the Texas weather, and his original plan had been to improve the land and then sell it at a significant profit. But the land was so well restored now that he found he was reluctant to part with it entirely, and he offered Luke the eastern section, the section with the irrigation, the best fence lines, the most carefully managed soil, at a price that was honest and manageable on the terms he proposed. A long-term arrangement that acknowledged what Luke's work had contributed to the land's value. They sat at the kitchen table in the boarding house for several evenings with the numbers, and the numbers were frightening but possible, and the possibility was real in a way that neither of them had let themselves believe a year ago. "Land," Maude said on the third evening, looking at the papers in the lamplight. "Our own land," Luke said. She looked at him. He was looking at the papers with the quality of attention he gave to everything, assessing certain. She put her hand on his. "Tell me what you think," she said. "Not the numbers, what you think." He looked up. "I think it is exactly what I have been working toward without knowing how to say it," he said. "I think it is ours if we choose it. I think I can make it into something, Maude, something real. I know this land now. I know what it needs and what it can give. I have been talking to it for 2 years and I understand what it's saying." She believed him entirely. She had been watching him for long enough to believe him entirely. "Then let us choose it," she said. They signed with Elias in June of 1884, and Luke began the particular joy of working land that belonged to him. A joy that was categorically different from working someone else's, deeper, more personal, more invested. The way a song means something different when it belongs to you rather than when you are singing it for someone else. Maude ran the boarding house, which continued to be the income that cushioned the first years of the land venture, and she made the transition gradually, year by year, as the land began to produce and the financial ground became more solid beneath them. Thomas was nearly 3 years old when his sister came along, in the winter of 1885, a dark-eyed, curious girl they named Clara, who immediately demonstrated that she had opinions about everything and intended to express all of them. She and Thomas were from the very beginning a matched pair in the way of children who are close in age and complement each other. He was steady, she was combustive, he watched and she spoke, and together they managed to keep two competent adults continuously occupied in the most rewarding way. The land grew. Luke expanded the irrigation to the northern sections, worked the soil into productivity with the same patient thoroughness he had always applied, learned the specific character of the Texas limestone soil, and talked about it endlessly in the evenings at the kitchen table while Maude listened and contributed, and occasionally told him something he had not considered, because she was that kind of listener. Their evenings were the richest part of their days, the children in bed, the lamp burning, coffee between them, the day's work talked over and the next day's plans made, and through all of it this quality of genuine partnership, two people who had each chosen carefully and well. Cutter's Creek changed around them, as towns changed in those years, growing a little, shifting a little, adjusting to the railroads that were slowly changing the texture of West Texas commerce. New people came. Some of the older residents moved on. The saloon was eventually replaced by a smaller, quieter establishment. The church got a new roof in 1886 and a new bell that rang a full octave brighter than the old one. Guillermo Vasquez grew older and frailer, and Luke and Maude made a point of looking in on him regularly. And when he died in 1887, they attended his funeral along with many others. And Luke said at the graveside, without preparation, that Guillermo had been one of the finest men he had ever known, and that he was grateful for having crossed his path. Guillermo's family, who had come down from their ranch north of the county, were visibly moved, and his oldest son shook Luke's hand afterward and said that his father had often spoken of the quiet man who worked Pratt's land and helped him with his grain and listened when he talked. Sheriff Bowman retired in 1887 and was replaced by a younger man who was competent and honest, which was adequate. Elias Pratt, his joints fully protesting the weather now, moved to San Antonio where the air was easier. But he came back to Cutter's Creek every summer and always made a point of walking the fence line with Luke and looking at what had been built. And the expression on his face when he did this was the expression of a man who made one very good decision and is spending the rest of his life being grateful for it. The year 1888 brought Thomas to the age of 5, which meant school, and this was a significant event in the Calloway household. Mr. Hayward, the schoolteacher boarder who had read Washington Irving to Thomas in his infancy, had since retired and been replaced at the school, but Thomas arrived on his first day with a vocabulary and a quality of attention that startled his new teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Florence Banks, who sent a note home after the first week saying that Thomas was extraordinary, and perhaps she could discuss it with his parents. Maude read this note to Luke at the kitchen table, and Luke looked at it for a moment and then looked at Maude and said, "He has been listening to you his whole life. What did you expect?" And Maude laughed so hard she had to put the note down. By the late 1880s, the Calloway land was producing well enough that Maude closed the boarding house, not because it had stopped working, but because it was no longer necessary, and the land demanded more of both of them. The closure of the boarding house felt like graduation, from the life that had been hers before him to the life that was theirs together. She was 31 years old, and she stood in the empty front room of the house on the last day before they made the final move out to the land property. And she looked at the place where she had made herself a life out of nothing, where she had learned to be enough, where she had opened the back door one evening and found a man who had seen her before she had finished seeing him. And she allowed herself a full minute of gratitude for all of it, the grief and the work and the watching and the finding. Then she went outside to where Luke was loading the wagon, and she climbed up beside him on the seat, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that still caught the light the way creek water catches it, and she took his hand, and they drove east toward the land and their children and everything that was next. The land was called Walker Calloway by the neighbors informally, because that was how it had been built. Maude's savings from the boarding house years had been as essential to purchasing it as Luke's labor had been to making it worth purchasing. They did not mind the double name. It felt true. In 1889, a third child came, a boy they named James, who was from the very first moment so sunny-natured and uncomplicated that both Maude and Luke watched him with a kind of affectionate bewilderment, as though they had expected difficulty and been handed ease. He slept well. He ate without argument. He smiled at everyone. Thomas, who was 6 and old enough to have opinions about the arrival of a sibling, decided quickly that James was acceptable and took on a big brother gravity that was, frankly, very funny in a 6-year-old. And Clara, who had been dethroned from her position as youngest, but was not the type to remain dethroned for long, staged a vigorous campaign for relevance that kept the household at full volume for approximately 3 months before a new equilibrium was reached. The household ran the way good households run, noisily and warmly, with structure enough to hold it and freedom enough to breathe in it. Maude had learned over years of running a boarding house how to manage multiple competing needs without diminishing any of them, and this skill translated directly to motherhood, perhaps because she approached both with the same quality of actual attention that she brought to everything. And Luke, who had spent his life learning how to read what things needed, brought that same quality to fatherhood, and the children felt it in the particular way that children always feel the difference between attention given freely and attention given as an obligation. On summer evenings, they sat on the porch of the ranch house that Luke had built over 2 years from the ground up, a solid, careful structure with a long front porch and windows designed to catch the western light, and watched the heat leave the sky slowly and the stars come in. The children would be around them, Thomas with his particular focused quietness, Clara with her insistence on describing everything she had seen and thought that day, and James gradually falling asleep in someone's arms. And the cottonwoods by the stock pond would be silver in the moonlight, and the nighthawks would be working the insect-thick air above the pasture. And it was possible, on evenings like this, to feel the completeness of things, the way certain lives arrive at themselves and know it. Luke would sometimes reach over and take Maude's hand in the darkness without saying anything, and she would lean slightly toward him, and they would sit like that while the night deepened, and neither of them needed to say what the other already knew. She had watched him work and said nothing because words had not been enough, and he had gone on working and waited for her to see what she was seeing, and she had seen it, and they had found each other on the specific ground of being people who paid real attention to real things. The town that had called him a coward had not watched him long enough or carefully enough to know what it was seeing. Maude had watched and had known in the way that leads to the particular and unshakable certainty of things that are simply true. In the late summer of 1890, something happened that brought the whole arc of the story to a kind of final point, not of ending, but of completion. Elias Pratt came back to Cutter's Creek for his annual visit, and spent a morning walking the land with Luke and an afternoon sitting on the porch with Maude. And in the late afternoon, with the light going gold and the children visible in the yard below, Thomas reading, Clara making something out of sticks and twine that she had been engineering for a week, James chasing a very patient dog, Elias said something that Maude thought about for a long time afterward. "I have seen a great many men work," Elias said. "I have hired men for 40 years in good times and bad. And I will tell you, Maude, that the quality your husband has, the patience, the intelligence, the willingness to do the quiet work without being seen for it, that is the rarest thing. That is the thing most people spend their lives pretending to have rather than actually cultivating. And I almost missed it. We almost missed it. This town almost ran him off." Maude was quiet for a moment. The children's voices rose and fell in the yard below. James had caught the dog and was sitting on it, which the dog appeared to regard as acceptable. "He was never going to let us run him off," she said. "He knew what he was doing. He was always going to finish what he started." "I know that now," Elias said. "I knew it earlier," she said without vanity, simply as fact. Elias looked at her. "You did," he said. "You watched and you knew. The rest of us were busy making assumptions. You were busy paying attention." She thought about the day at the fence rail, the 2 hours of watching, the quality of what she had been seeing and her difficulty in naming it. She thought about the evening at the kitchen table when he had told her he intended to court her properly, and the porch step below her when he had asked her to marry him. She thought about the water running through the irrigation channel for the first time, and his smile, and the way the whole story of them had been built on the simple act of looking closely at something until you actually saw it. "Someone had to," she said quietly. The year 1891 brought a very late frost that damaged some of the early crops but left the land itself undamaged, and Luke spent 2 days assessing and recalculating, and managed to recover more of the season than anyone expected. He was 37 now, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of working in the Texas sun, and his hands were a landscape of work. And he was, in Maude's estimation, the most purely handsome person she had ever seen, which had nothing to do with features and everything to do with the way his face expressed exactly what he was, no more and no less. Thomas was 7, and already asking serious questions about the irrigation system, which Luke answered with genuine detail, treating his son's curiosity with the same respect he gave everyone's intelligence. Clara was 6 and had declared her intention to be a doctor, which was stated with such absolute conviction that neither parent saw any reason to challenge it. James was 2 and entirely happy. In the evenings, Maude sometimes took out the small piece of crystal-shot limestone that Luke had given her early in their courtship, the piece from the ridge that was shot through with light, and held it in her hands and thought about the years. The year she had held the blue calico and heard a word applied to a man she did not yet know. The years of watching, the year of marrying, the years of building, the years of children and land and partnership, and all the small daily ceremonies of a life that was genuinely, carefully loved. She thought about the title coward and what it had meant and what it had concealed, the particular injury of a word applied to something it did not describe, the particular grace of the person who bears such a word without being diminished by it, who simply continues to be what they are, and trusts that the truth of them will eventually be readable to the people who are paying attention. She thought about what she had said nothing when she stood on that boardwalk and watched him walk away from Clement Deacon's provocation with his supplies. She had said nothing because there was nothing to say. What she had seen in that moment was beyond anything that the available words could carry. She had seen courage of a kind so specific and so disciplined that it had no name in the ordinary vocabulary of a Texas town in 1882. She had known it for what it was, and she had been right. By the winter of 1891, the Walker-Calloway land was prosperous in the modest, solid way of land that is well managed by people who understand both its possibilities and its limits. They were not wealthy in the way of the cattle barons further west, but they were secure, which is a different and often more durable thing, and the security had been built by their own work and their own intelligence and their own willingness to be patient with things that required patience. Luke, who had a gift for reading other men's problems, had begun to be consulted by neighboring ranchers and homesteaders on questions of water and soil and fence management, and he gave his knowledge freely and practically, traveling to properties throughout the county and occasionally beyond it. He was not paid formally for most of this. It was the currency of community, given and returned in kind, but his reputation spread further, and his name became one that people said with a particular quality, the quality that attaches to names of people who have genuinely helped rather than merely impressed. Maude, whose eye for what people needed was as sharp as her eye for what the land needed, had begun quietly assisting women in the area who were in difficult circumstances, widows in the early hard years of widowhood, families going through lean periods, occasionally women whose circumstances were of a kind that the community preferred not to look at directly, which was to say women whose husbands were not kind. She was not a crusader. She did not make speeches. She was present in the way she had always been present, with full attention and practical help and no expectation of gratitude, and it was not nothing, the effect of this. It was the slow and real kind of change that does not announce itself. She was 33 years old and she was in the full strength of herself, which was a remarkable thing to be. One Sunday morning in January of 1892, very cold and very clear, they stood outside the church after the service in the sharp light with their children around them. Thomas serious and tall for 8, Clara bright-eyed and voluble at 7, James at 3 completely absorbed in trying to catch the shadow of a bird on the frozen ground, and Elias Pratt, who had come back for the winter this time because San Antonio had not agreed with his lungs the previous year, came to them with a look on his face that was festive in an unusual way for a man of his particular restraint. "What is it?" Maude asked him. "Nothing," Elias said. "I am simply looking at something that makes me happy." "It is allowed, I hope." She looked at what he was looking at. She saw Luke crouching down to help James understand why the bird's shadow would not stay still, speaking to him with complete seriousness and patience, and Thomas standing nearby with that particular focused attention of his, and Clara already moving on to the next interesting thing but calling back to her father, and Luke managing all of this without losing his composure or his warmth, the way he managed everything, efficiently, with genuine pleasure in it. She understood what Elias was looking at. She turned back to him and said, "Yes, it is allowed." That afternoon, while the children were napping and the cold light came in sideways through the western windows, and the ranch was quiet in the way it was only ever quiet on Sunday afternoons, Luke came and sat beside her on the sofa where she was reading. He sat close, and she put her book down, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they were quiet together for a long time, the way people are quiet together when the quiet is itself a form of speaking, when two people have become so genuinely known to each other that silence is as full as conversation. "Are you happy?" he asked eventually, not because he was uncertain, but because he liked asking, liked hearing the answer, liked the way she always told him the truth. She turned to look at him. His gray eyes, the Creekwater eyes, were close and warm and entirely present. She thought of everything the question contained: the land outside the windows that they had made together, the children sleeping above them, the years of work and love and difficulty and joy, the blue calico dress and the fence rail and the boardwalk and the slow brown river in the September dark. "Luke," she said, "I am so happy that sometimes it frightens me." He pulled her closer. "Then I will keep being exactly here," he said, so there is nothing to be frightened of." She rested her head against his shoulder and felt the warmth of him and the steady, certain quality of him, the quality she had been watching since the very first day. And she understood that she had been right about everything she had seen in him, every patient and careful and completely unglamorous piece of it, and he had been right about her. And they had found each other in the slow and serious way of people who do not look for shortcuts, who know that the real thing is always built from the ground up and takes the time it takes. Outside, the Texas afternoon was cold and gold and enormous, the limestone hills pink at their edges the way they always were at this hour, the cottonwoods silver, the stock pond holding the light on its dark surface. And somewhere near the east fence line, a mockingbird was going through its entire repertoire with the extravagant confidence of a creature who has never doubted for a moment its right to be heard. The land was quiet and the house was warm, and the children would wake soon with their noise and their needs and their specific, particular selves. And there would be supper to make and the evening chores, and the next day's plans to lay out at the kitchen table with coffee between them and the lamp burning low. And every bit of it was theirs, built from nothing, built from the particular and stubborn willingness to see clearly and work honestly and love without reservation, which was, in the end, the only kind of love that had ever mattered, and the only kind that lasts.